Good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar, Maximizing Your Membership. We're going to try to break down some of the big headlines that are coming at us today with a bit of a chat with our President and CEO, Dan Kelly, who we'll talk to in just a moment. I'm just going to hold off here for a few minutes as we wait for folks to come on into the webinar as people are still strolling in. My name in advance of that is Corinne Pullman. I'm the Executive Vice President. I'm based here in Ottawa. I want to, just before we get started, also do a few housekeeping things, and I will repeat this as more and more people enter. I'm just watching the numbers creep up as we go. So just a reminder that we have a Q&A and a chat function at the bottom of the screen. If you have a question, we invite you to add that into the Q&A function if possible. It's a lot easier for us to manage questions if they're in the Q&A. You are welcome to use the chat, and the chat is where you're going to find a copy of this presentation if you're interested in downloading it. So you will see in the chat a link, and from there you can get a copy of the presentation for yourself. First thing I want to do, though, is find out where everybody's coming from. So if you can send a little bit of a note in the chat on what part of the world you're coming from, or what part of Canada, I should say, you're coming from, that would be great. Oh, look at this. We got Calgary, London, Jasper, Ontario, Burlington, Cranbrook, Guelph. Oh my goodness, it's just going crazy. Halifax, Vancouver, St. John, New Brunswick, Courtenay, BC, Nanaimo. It's so amazing to see where everybody's coming from right across the country. And want to thank you for joining us today. I think we have a pretty special webinar for you. I'm very excited to have my colleague, Dan Kelly, with us. And with that, we're going to start to get moving into the next page, and I'm going to introduce you. I already said who I am, Corinne Pullman, but with me today is Dan Kelly, our President and CEO, and I'm going to ask Dan to say a few words about how things are going at CFIB these days before we jump into some of the headlines. Over to you, Dan.
Thanks so much, Corinne. It's good to be with you, and it's good to have so many members on the webinar with us today. It was so cool to see, as you said, Corinne, how many were coming from every corner of the country. Look, these have been crazy days, and there are so many issues that are coming at us at a time of great political and economic instability. Times are challenging for a lot of our members, and certainly our data is showing that. We just released today some fairly sobering stats on our business barometer, which measures small business optimism across the country. But there's lots of good stuff happening too, and I'm looking forward to getting into the discussion of what's happening in Ottawa and on the political scene, and of course all the economic issues and political ones stemming from Washington as well. And we've been hustling on a whole bunch of fronts at a time it's hard to figure out which government we're going to be facing in the next number of days, let alone what kind of policy framework we're going to see coming up. Just looking closer to home, though, at CFIB, I do want to make note of something that happened late last year, and that is that our organization, our association, of which you've been a member, many of you for a long period of time, we crossed the 100,000 member mark, 100,000 paying member mark for the first time in our history. This was really cool. We've always had a bunch of introductory members, people that perhaps we were serving for a period of time prior to becoming members, but we have 100,000 paying members at CFIB for the first time, and that's really, really cool. That every new member that joins us gives us additional power and clout in Ottawa, in provincial capitals, and increasingly at municipal governments across the country. So grateful that business owners are joining us, including at a time when it can be challenging for many to do that. We've been really building out our service offering. We're going to focus, of course, on some of the legislative issues today, but I know we've done other webinars and have more to come on some of the new services that we're providing for members. Corinne, I think you're going to share at the end of the presentation another upcoming webinar on some of the partnerships that we have signed with companies across the country. The goal is, of course, to bring savings to small business owners by negotiating some of these agreements where we can get scale and get better deals than perhaps you might be able to get individually as a business owner. And we've added dozens and dozens of new partnerships over the last year to try to deepen the value of a CFIB membership. So I've had great feedback on many of these, and there's some new ones that are coming up. I will remind you, just for example, of our Chase deal for payment processing. CFIB members collectively process $18 billion a year with Chase, which just gives us great clout in negotiating better rates than are widely available to most businesses across the country. The other big change that we've made at CFIB is investing in our business advisory service. We've got some terrific business advisors, some of whom are on the call today, and we'll answer some of your questions in the live chat. But I will add that we've now deepened that focus on the human resources aspects. So many small businesses don't have, I'm sure most of you don't have your own HR professional on staff, and use our team as kind of the back office HR function to get those answers to questions quickly. We're calling it HR Now, with the emphasis being on getting answers now to questions that you have. We've had such significant demand that we have had a bit of a temporary challenge to try to get everybody, every call answered as they come in, but we typically have about an 80% 80 to 85% live answer rate. Try that with Air Canada or your phone company. You don't get somebody on the phone very often, but 80 to 85% of the time you do get somebody on the phone available to answer your question right then and there, or do the research that they need to give you a proper answer. And related to that is the biggest and probably one of the biggest investments that we've made at CFIB in adding legal advice and services. And I believe, Corinne, there was a recent webinar on this topic. We've partnered with a company called Lavo that basically connects our members to independent lawyers. We can, through some of their tools, answer many legal questions now for you through our business advisors. But when we can't, we can pass you at no cost to you on to a lawyer for some initial service. And then if you do need representation, then we've negotiated a discounted rate for those services across the country. I've had tremendous feedback. In fact, sometimes when we offer a new service, members take a while before they discover it and use it. Not in this case. We've had, in fact, demand has been much greater than we expected for our legal advice. And so in some of the older webinars, which I believe are posted on YouTube, you can find out and watch one with information on how you can take advantage of this free included service as part of your membership. Not cheap to do, but really excited that we're now able to provide that. So those are just a couple of the behind the scenes things, Corinne, that I wanted to mention before we shift into to the topic at hand, and that is to figure out what the heck is going on in Ottawa these days.
That's right. Yeah, what the heck is going on? All right, let's move to the next slide, please. So we do want to give you just a quick snapshot of what we're hearing from you, and then we're going to touch on these 4 topics. Dan and I have a short conversation, then we're going to try to spend a good chunk of time also answering any questions that you may have on these, or really any other issue that you want to sort of pose to Dan, given the opportunity to do so today. Okay, so we're going to move to the next slide. This is, again, just wanted to give you a bit of a synopsis of what it is our members, you, are telling us about what your priorities are for 2025. Of course, this is what dictates what we do as an organization. When we take on legislative work or we decide to lobby on a topic, it's because you're telling us these are topics that are important to you. So at the beginning of this year, just about a month ago or so, basically reducing the overall tax burden, addressing the cost of doing business are 2 of the top 2. And so a lot of what we do right now is to try to find ways to lower cost of doing business. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where the uncertainty is actually increasing costs. And of course, tariffs could do the same. But we're going to do everything we can to see if there's ways that those things can be mitigated in other ways. But also important are things like quality of healthcare, improving productivity, reducing red tape. These are all issues that we do try to take some sort of a position on, and well, let's try to push forward with government. So most of these, as you can see, are of a high priority for our members right across the country. So having said that, we take these initiatives and we take it to the federal government and provincial governments, but today we'll talk mostly about the federal because that is where a lot of the question marks are. So if we go to the next slide, So just a little bit of an overview of where we're at right now in the political landscape in Ottawa. It's kind of a bit confusing and all over the place, but you may recall back like just about a month ago, a little over a month ago, Prime Minister Trudeau did announce his resignation. Now he hasn't stepped down yet. He will resign once a new Liberal leader is chosen. That Liberal leadership will be that leader will be selected on March 9th. The top contenders right now seem to be Mark Carney and Chrystia Freeland, and I know there was just a debate, I believe it was yesterday, on this and in French the night before. And when Justin Trudeau did resign, he also prorogued Parliament, which basically means they shut it down for a certain period of time. It was supposed to start at the end of January. Now it won't be starting until March 24th, about 3 weeks after the new Liberal leader is elected. And then, of course, we don't know what's going to happen. Is there going to be an election right away? The opposition parties have signaled that they would take down a government as soon as they possibly could, whenever that would happen. Whoever the new Liberal leader is may decide to have an election. So these are all things I want to talk to you about a little bit more, Dan. So just to get your take on things a little bit. So first of all, what impact has all this sort of political turmoil federally had on the work that CFIB does?
Well, look, it does make our work more challenging as we may have potentially 3 governments to lobby in the next 6 months. We have, of course, the government of the day that Trudeau still heads with Dominic LeBlanc as finance minister. Then, when the Liberal leader is selected, then there may be unless that guy unless that he or she pulls the plug. We may have at least some weeks or months of a new Liberal government under a brand new prime minister, one of whom might not even have a seat in the House of Commons, and whomever becomes finance minister at that stage. And then post-election, potentially a brand new government with a new leader and finance minister to lobby. So we have strategies in play, as you know, as you're doing a large chunk of this or these efforts. We have strategies for all 3. And what we're doing right now may need to shift upon the election of a new Liberal leader, a new Liberal prime minister. And then again, perhaps if there is a change in government, we may have to shift gears once again. So what I've been so impressed with is the team that Corinne leads in Ottawa has been meeting day in, day out with with members of Parliament of all political stripes to ensure that CFIB is well suited, regardless of who is in power at the time. And just as a quick aside, for the more immediate term, whether it's Mark Carney or Chrystia Freeland, we know both of them extremely well. CFIB has had for many, many years an annual or biannual meeting with the governor of the Bank of Canada. And so Corinne, you and I have had, lots of lunches with fancy pickles on the table with Mark Carney and, of course, more recently, his replacement. And we've done the same with Chrystia Freeland, as many members know. We had, prior to Freeland, Bill Morneau really didn't want to have anything to do with CFIB, and we fought really hard because we scarred him pretty hard during the 2017 tax fight over small business policy. When Freeland took the reins in finance, she reached out to us on day one, and then during the pandemic, we had almost weekly checkpoints with her and emails back and forth. And so we have a very long and deep working relationship with her, lots of fights and battles along the way, but she knows who we are and I think respects the work of the Federation. She has been, the governor of the Bank of Canada and Chrystia Freeland have been guests on webinars, Corinne, with you in the years in the past. So we're well set up, regardless of who becomes the next Liberal premier. And then, of course, the potential is that we may have a Conservative government, depending on the timing and results of the election. And we have met with dozens and dozens of Conservative MPs over the last number of months and have a good working relationship. A little bit of a strain, I would say, with Poilievre himself, in that he's not a big fan of advocacy organizations generally. But I would say that now that the election looks like it's going to be more competitive, that seems to have softened that approach, and we're getting a lot more reach out than we've had in the past. So look, we're well set up for any of these scenarios. some of the files that we'll talk about in just a minute. Obviously, the approach that we use is slightly different depending on who is in power.
Great, thanks, Dan. We'll move to the next slide.
Oh, sorry, Corinne. Maybe I'll just add, this is the worst possible time for political uncertainty, though, in Canada. Like it is shameful that we are where we are with the Prime Minister waiting so long to announce his resignation, that this is happening and has created this political vacuum in Canada, all this uncertainty at a time when that's what we need. We need political uncertainty to push back against what we're seeing from the Americans right now. Obviously, this is very much connected to the tariff discussion, but it is very disappointing to see that. So the sooner we can get clarity on who is leading the government of Canada, in my view, the better. And that we need to do now. And it's one of the reasons, Corinne, why you and I have been pushing to try to get the legislative, to try to get Parliament back in session, because as we'll discuss in a second, there's lots of unfinished business that really needs to get across the finish line to make sure that Canada is well set up for any eventuality, depending on what happens with the US.
Yeah. Mark's got a quick question about, I'm not going to ask this now, but I'm going to respond to you, Mark. You're saying which one of our leaders looks to be the best fit for small business owners and what sets them apart. I think from that one, Mark, what I'd like to do is let you know that once an election is called, we will probably have some sort of webinar around that time to sort of talk about what the different parties are putting out there, what that looks like, so that you can help make that assessment on your own. We're here to make sure that you have all the information that you need. So when it comes to understanding who is best for small business, which ones are pushing issues that are good for small businesses and which one may not be. So we will certainly come to that a bit more in the future. I did want to move on, and we will come back to some of the questions. Can I ask you to put the questions in the Q&A, though, because it's easier for us if they're in the Q&A to manage, so I'd appreciate that. But I want to jump into the capital gains changes. So back in 2024, a little just about a year ago now, there was a federal budget that proposed changes to various components of capital gains. There was actually three parts to those. First, there was the lifetime capital gains exemption, which they were raising from $1 million to $1.25 million. And I'm going to come back to that. There was also something called the New Canadian Entrepreneurs Incentive, which would actually also give you even more ability to pay at a lower rate if you sell your business. The capital gains inclusion would be even lower on the next amount after the 1.25 million would be in place. But the third component, of course, was an increase to the capital gains inclusion rate itself from 50% to 66.7%. Since then, there's been a lot of discussion. There was no legislation passed, but there was motions put forward. The motions that were put forward did actually include the lifetime capital gains exemption from 1 to 1.25, as well as the capital gains inclusion rate from 50 to 66.7%. So what that meant is that CRA had the ability to now basically impose them basically on businesses that that were going to be facing capital gains, whether it's a sale of their business in a positive way on the lifetime capital gains exemption, or in some other means of capital gains, meaning they have to pay the higher inclusion rate. We've been fighting hard against these, and back because of this change in government and this bit of this kind of weird situation that we're in that Dan just described, the government did finally on January 31st clarify that they are deferring the increase in the capital gains inclusion rate from 50% to 66.7% until 2026. So after the next election. So that is now off the table. You don't have to worry about an increase in the capital gains inclusion rate. For now, the lifetime capital gains exemption increase is staying. It's at 1.25 million, but it has not been passed into legislation. So that could still be, that may still be removed, or it may still move forward. Same with the capital gains inclusion rate. That may still move forward, or it may stay at 50%. So Dan, knowing all this, and this I know it gets a little confusing, where do you think this will all go?
Yeah, my crystal ball you're asking about. Okay.
Yes.
Look, there is now a pathway, Corinne, and I know you know this, but a pathway to actually have our cake and eat it too. And this was actually challenging. There were rumors that the government was going to do something big in the 2024 budget This was all, of course, an attempt to try to get the Conservatives to push back in order to show that the Conservatives support the rich, the so-called rich, and that the Liberals or the NDP, supports everyday folks. And so the government put out some really torqued information about who pays the higher rates of capital gains, forgetting, of course, that it is small business owners that are big that get affected by this very, very directly. So when you and I were in the budget lockup, our response was challenging because there were, as you just said, good things and bad things in this package. Very bad to increase the inclusion rate, but super positive to increase the lifetime capital gains exemption. And then this new Canada Entrepreneurs Incentive, the CEI, it actually has some real potential. It's quite disastrous in the way that they've structured it at the moment. But if we look long term, this could be a really important building block to succession for business owners for their long-term sale of their firms. So if we play our cards right, we could, and I didn't think this was going to be possible even a few months ago, but we could see a scenario where we ditch the bad and kill the increase in the capital gains rate, the inclusion rate, and keep the lifetime capital gains exemption. I think there's a good chance that we'll be able to protect that. I'd say 50-50 odds that we might be able to get this Canada Entrepreneurs Incentive in some fashion across the finish line. Even if it's not great when it first launches, that's the kind of thing for advocacy groups like us we could use for the next decade to make sure that it is broadened out to include as many businesses as possible. So I do think, like, the good news is that the push to increase capital gains, in part because of the U.S. threat, is now, and the change in leadership and the Liberal Party, that one seems, I'd say the threat is still there for an increase in the inclusion rate, but I would say it's low, because I think both Freeland and Carney have suggested, in fact, I think even Karina Gould has also discounted the option on that front. So it looks like the Liberals themselves are backing away from the increase in the inclusion rate, and that is good news, depending on who becomes prime minister. And then on these other two pieces, it was a surprise to me anyway, that LeBlanc recommitted to the increase in the inclusion rate, didn't push it forward like he did the increase in the LCGE. He didn't kick it forward like he did for the increase in the inclusion rate. He protected it for it is right now in effect as of June 25th, 2024. And then the CEI thing, it's still not, as you said, it's not part of the legislative calendar right now, but the government, the finance minister did commit to moving ahead with this as of January 1st of 2025 upon passage. So we have a decent chance of protecting that, which would be good news.
Great. We're going to move on to the next slide. And this one, of course, is carbon tax. So we were really happy to see, of course, the government did return $2.5 billion in carbon tax revenues to small and medium-sized businesses in all provinces that have the carbon tax back in December. Late November, early December, and I'm hopeful that many of you were able to benefit from that. There is, though, the story is not over as a result of this. This is an ongoing saga, the carbon tax and the carbon tax rebate. So there are a few things that we're still pushing for. First of all, is that we need to pass legislation so that the carbon tax rebate for small businesses is tax-free. There's been some confusion around this, and I'm going to ask you to maybe explain that one a little bit more. But let me go through the rest, and then we'll come back to that question. We also want them to drop the increase. So April 1st, we'll see a 19% increase in the carbon tax if nothing changes. So a big push for us right now, especially given the situation that we're finding ourselves in at the moment, is for government to drop that increase at the very least at this point in time, so that we don't see an increase again on April 1st, which would be quite substantial. We also feel like as long as the carbon tax is in place, the government needs to make sure that the small business rebate continues, and it needs to be at the formula that it's always been at over the last 5 years. They actually changed the formula to make this proportion for small businesses smaller for 2024 and 5 and beyond. And so we want them to go back to the original, which is 9% of all carbon tax revenues be returned to small businesses. So that's another one. And we want to make sure that unincorporated businesses get included in that rebate because they aren't so far. And of course, the final thing is you have told us, 83% of you have told us you'd like to see the federal target carbon tax eliminated. So that has been a huge component of our advocacy work, is to say that we need to finally get rid of this carbon tax. So I am going to come back to a couple things here. First and foremost, is the carbon tax rebate tax-free or not? And what happened there?
Sure. Well, look, let me tell my little story on this from a behind the scenes lobbying perspective. When the federal carbon tax was first announced back in 2019, applying in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario, I think Alberta actually was out for year one, but in for the other 4 years. The government promised to return 90% of the revenue to consumers through the consumer rebate, and 10% of the revenue back to small businesses. And a lot of small businesses, I would imagine most of you didn't even know that there was a commitment made to return 10% of the revenues back to small businesses. And you could be forgiven for not knowing that because they never did it. So for 5 straight years, those 4 provinces had the federal carbon tax in place, and the government failed to return a nickel of that dollar to the vast majority of businesses across the piece, despite its promise. They kept saying they were going to do it. They came up with a couple scenarios, looked like ridiculous ways of doing this. And so back in the spring budget, Corinne, you and I were in Toronto, and we went and met with Chrystia Freeland, and we said, come on, this is ridiculous. And we had to propose a formula to get the government to finally figure out how to do this. I don't even think it was a lack of political will. It was the fact that they just didn't have a clue how to return the money to small businesses in any kind of structure. So we put together a scenario. It certainly wasn't perfect, but the government did agree to it. It was supposed to be, it was always assumed that it was going to be tax-free, just like the consumer rebate that was tax-free. If you receive that for your home and your family's consumption of energy, when you get those quarterly, what are they, the Canada carbon rebate checks, those are right now personally tax-free. So that was our assumption walking into this. I think it was government's assumption too. And then the CRA said, oh, wait a minute, you know those checks that you're planning to send out, Chrystia Freeland, they're going to be taxable because the way you've structured them is as government support for business. Give me a break. This is not government support for business. This is a rebate of the taxes that businesses have actually paid, and only a portion of the taxes that they paid. It would be like taxing your tax return after you filed your income taxes, you're owed a refund, and then we're going to tax that refund that you were supposed to get. So stupid. So we hit the roof. We lobbied internally. That didn't go anywhere for a week, for a few weeks. So we went public on this. The day we went public, Freeland called me and said, Dan, we're going to fix this. She announced that publicly. The government of Canada put on its finance website that these rebate checks that were going out would be tax-free. Then December hits. The checks go out. Of course, the government issues the rebate checks during the Canada Post strike for those that hadn't signed up for automatic deposit. But that $2.5 billion was dispersed to the vast majority of 600,000 small and medium-sized companies across 8 provinces, because Atlantic Canada by that point had been included. And then, Corinne, you found out in a meeting with the CRA only a few months ago that, in fact, that fix that finance had talked about, well, they never did it. And so the rebates were supposed to be taxable. And of course, we hit the roof again, gave them some time to try to fix this. They couldn't figure out a pathway to fix this when we went public with this. The government says that it is committed to making this tax-free, but unfortunately, because Parliament is prorogued, they don't have the ability to do that until such time as Parliament comes back. So we have been seeking a commitment from the Conservatives, and informally, they've told us that they will honor this and make it tax-free. The Liberals say that they're going to do this, but again, we have a new Prime Minister coming into place. This is so stupid. In my 30 years of advocacy, I can't think of a file that has been more ridiculous to try to get basic changes and promises met as the carbon tax. And it's little wonder that now the vast majority of our members want the whole structure disassembled. And it does look like that's going to happen, regardless of whether it's the Conservatives or the Liberals in power, as both Freeland and Carney have committed to winding down that. Now, what they're going to replace it with could be as bad or worse, but at least they've committed to getting rid of the structure that is in place at this time. We still have to lobby, as you noted, because there is outstanding rebate money that should be coming out for 2024, 2025 at reduced amounts, but we're trying to get them to make good on that promise too, and we're going to have to lobby both the Conservatives and the Liberals to make that happen.
I just want to mention before we move on, there was a couple of inquiries that came in from Stephen and Colin about if they hadn't received the small business carbon tax rebate yet, what should they do? So Alicia's been responding, but just for anybody else that may be in that situation, could you please contact us, call us at our business helpline, and we can help look into why you may not have received your carbon tax rebate yet. We'll give you that number at the end of the webinar. Because you should have received it by now. Everybody should have received it by now. Even if it was in the mail and got caught during the Canada Post strike, you still should have received it by now. So something may have happened, and so we can help you look into why that might be. So I just wanted to make sure that people were aware of that.
The big groups that would not be eligible, though, would be, of course, British Columbia is not included in this mix. Quebec is not included in the federal carbon tax. They have their own systems. Secondly, anybody that is unincorporated and not filing a corporate income tax return, they don't qualify. If you don't have paid staff, you don't qualify for it. And that's the fix that you were trying to get for the next round of rebate money. So that could be the reason. But if you do have paid staff, you're in one of the 8 provinces, Atlantic Canada, the West three Prairie provinces, or Ontario, you should have received a check. Yeah. And if you're incorporated, you have paid staff, and you're in one of those 8 provinces where the tax applies.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to move on to the final topic, which is going to be a big one. So next slide, please. This is, of course, the big elephant in the room right now, which is tariffs. So we wanted to give you a bit of an overview. I know there's a lot of information. It's changing every single day when it comes to tariffs from the United States. So we wanted to give you the latest information as we understand it of when and where they're going to be applied by the Americans. So this will give you that sense. So as of right now, Canada and Mexico's 25% tariff from the Americans is going to be applied probably on March 4th. We heard yesterday, maybe it was April 2nd. Today, it seems to be back to March 4th. So we're still kind of going back and forth, and we may not know until as we did last time, until the day of whether it's actually going to go ahead or not. But as of right now, it is March 4th, with the possibilities that maybe it'll get pushed again to April 2nd.
And that's 25% on every Canadian good other than energy products, which would be at 10%.
Correct. That's right. Also, our steel and aluminum tariffs, from which we understand will be placed on top of the Canada and Mexico tariffs. So that would be another 25%, which will come into effect on March 12th. That's what the Americans are saying right now. And that is globally, not just in Canada, but for all countries that export steel and aluminum into the United States. Some of the others that
we're their largest supplier, so that affects us more deeply than anywhere else.
Yeah, it'll affect our steel and aluminum businesses for sure that export into the United States. Also, I think it's important to note is there's something that Trump is calling his reciprocal tariffs, which are tariffs that will go to basically any country in the world that they see as imposing a tariff on the United States. They will do a reciprocal tariff. That is right now, maybe April 2nd or so. And of course, in addition to all this, the countermeasure, so that will affect all the exporters, of course, that go into the United States. But the reciprocal to that is Canada's response to whatever happens on March 4th or April 2nd or some date beyond that, of which would be probably a 25% tariff, not on everything. Canada has sort of narrowed it down initially to a list that would include about $30 billion of goods. You'll see a link on the sheet that is the original list that they put out on February 4th as the initial one, with the plans to expand that to as much as I think 150 billion if the tariffs would continue. So that would have a huge impact, of course, on importers coming into Canada. So this is a very fluid situation right now, and it's one that we're trying to keep updated. If we go to the next slide, we can come back to this afterwards. I wanted to give you a bit of a quick overview before Dan and I have a couple more, we'll start answering questions and maybe get into a bit of a conversation. But some of the work that we're trying to do at CFIB to make sure that we're preparing you and pushing back on governments where we can. So we are in regular contact with all those political leaders and other business groups who are part of coalitions trying to push back on many of these things. We've interacted, Dan and I have interacted with our American counterparts in the United States to sort of get a feel from them about what's happening. We're very focused on other things we can do to mitigate the impacts, reducing costs, such as we just talked about, carbon tax, capital gains tax, that kind of thing. Red tape's another big area for us, and where we put a lot of emphasis, and interprovincial trade is another one. We have been very active on interprovincial trade barriers and trying to get rid of them for over a decade now. It's been a start and stop type of file. Now seems to have some momentum. We're really actually encouraged by some of the things we're hearing from the federal and provincial governments. Just this week, the federal government agreed to eliminate more than half of what they called exemptions to the Interprovincial Trade Act, which will make it easier, for example, for businesses to do businesses across the country. Nova Scotia, just earlier this week, has come out and said that they will mutually recognize other provinces' rules and certifications if that province is doing it as well. We have since heard Ontario make that kind of a commitment as part of its election campaign, which is going on. Today's election day in Ontario, but also BC seems to be moving in that direction as well. So this is very positive, and we're going to continue to push hard on all the provinces and the federal government to do something. We're going to advocate, of course, for business support programs. Should tariffs be implemented, we will want to make sure that any supports that are made available to businesses are also easily accessible by smaller companies, because sometimes these initiatives are focused more on larger firms, but we want to make sure that anybody affected will also be able to access these types of supports. We have done a webinar with a lot more detail and technical detail about tariffs, how they work, what you can do to prepare, that kind of thing, just 2 weeks ago. If you missed it, you may want to take a look at it. We had Joy Knott, a trade expert, the trade compliance expert, join us for that. And I think there's lots of great information in there if you're looking for a little bit more detail. We're going to continue to do all kinds of survey research. We have a web page that's up and running that's going to be constantly updated with the latest information. So that's at CFIB.ca/tariffs that I recommend you take a look at. I do want to talk about shopping local, but we do have local posters that's come up as one of the questions. So we'll get into that discussion in a minute. And of course, this is where our team can help wherever possible. We have good government contacts. The government is going to come to us asking for what the impacts look like, what can they do more of. So talking to our business advisors, answering our surveys, talking to your district manager, all are different ways you can share with us the impact it's having on you, and allows us to provide government with the latest information so they can provide the right supports and provide the right information that you may need as we go through this fairly unprecedented time. So, Dan, this is one that's a tough one, and I know you're hearing from a lot of members about this. So I wonder if you can give us a bit of a sense of the things that you're hearing from our members.
Sure. Look, we've collected a couple rounds of fantastic data from our members. So thank you so much for sending those thoughts of what this is going to do to your business, or the impacts you're already seeing in your business as a result of that. Look, this is so tricky because, if we've got 4 straight years of sleeping with one eye open, obviously, with the latest comment from the president south of us, this is going to be a long haul. And on many days, I think, look, this uncertainty that has been created, perhaps that is the end goal, is just to create ongoing, not necessarily use tariffs, but just keep the threat of tariffs alive, so that business owners are thinking, well, maybe I just need to be in the US just to protect myself and have the certainty I need to be able to plan. And we're hearing that from members, that some of them are vulnerable to approaches from US states and others to relocate or to expand their operations into the United States rather than in Canada. And that's such an unfortunate thing when that happens. Hopefully, we will see the jets cool a little bit on this, but we have to be prepared for any eventuality. What I've heard from a lot of members, though, is that, many of them are just kind of in the hope and pray strategy right now, which is that they hope that this doesn't come to be. But the preparation that they're doing is, rather than taking steps now, is they're putting in place contingency plans such that if tariffs do come to pass, then they'll be able to move quickly. So that might mean seeking, if you're an importer, seeking other suppliers from other provinces in Canada, perhaps, or around the world, to displace some of the things that you might have bought from the United States that have become more expensive because Canada has slapped a tariff on those goods in response to the US. Our data shows that our members, while our own tariffs would be terrible and hurt our domestic population and business owners dramatically, that there is support for them broadly because, to be a serious country, we can't just roll over and do nothing about this either. So there is support for some retaliatory tariffs on the part of our membership, but they are going to bite hard. We have 16% of our members that export directly to the United States, but 49% of you import directly from the United States. And so it's that retaliatory tariff that Canada would impose that would have the greatest impact. So seeking other suppliers is a good deal, is a good thing to do. A lot of companies, of course, if they export, they're looking at what other export markets we have. Canada does have a lot of other free trade agreements. That's one of the few things that I think has gone well over the last number of years is we have an agreement with the entire EU. We have an agreement with most of the Pacific Rim nations, Australia, New Zealand. So we do have free trade access in most fields in covering a ton of countries. We're the only G7 country that has a trade agreement with every other G7 country. So we do have some degree of diversification, but it's hard to displace a market the size of the United States and, of course, as proximate as it is to us.
I'm going to ask Hankesh if you could just take down we're going to move on to sort of more general Q&A,
Sure.
but obviously continue this conversation around the tariff side of the equation. And I want to get to Dave's question, which is like this. Dave, I'm just going to edit it down a little bit but the gist of it is small business owners are saying needs COVID type government support right now. Part of it's the mortgage renewal crisis. Obviously, part of it is higher grocery, fuel, tariffs. All of those things combined is making it very difficult in terms of cash flow. And that he's a feeling that this is actually a larger threat to our survival than COVID probably was. So what can governments do? What is CFIB's plans to help, basically support? What are the types of supports that could be made available? It's similar to some of the questions we got before the webinar as well. Like, what are the types of supports? What it is that we think that government should be doing to help businesses through this pretty unprecedented time?
Look, there's a variety of things that governments can do, and there's of course a few things that governments shouldn't do. Of course, we know that there may be some changes to EI policy that may become necessary, waiving the waiting periods, for example, if people start to lose their jobs in large numbers in some of the fields that are directly affected by US tariffs. That seems like one that the government will likely do. What I hope they don't do is put in place a botched CERB-style program that they did during the pandemic. Of course, we all know what happened there is of course, there were people that needed that money and they needed it quickly, but it didn't serve the self-employed particularly well. And so some of our members needed cash infusions that didn't get it or didn't get it in sufficient amounts because it was capped at $2,000. But what it did is it also sucked out a lot of low and medium wage earners from the workforce who basically just shifted and sat on CERB for month on end, and then employers struggled to get them back when the economy reopened at that time. So I'm really hoping the government doesn't go down that road again in some kind of holus bolus way. And I worry about that in particular because we have an election. You can imagine it would be pretty popular among a large swath of the Canadian population if a government were to announce some kind of $2,000 widely available benefit to Canadians. So that's one thing to worry about. The wage subsidy, look, all of the COVID support programs we were involved in advocating for, primarily to make sure that they were at least working for some businesses. None of them worked perfectly. But our data shows that without those COVID support programs, so many more members would have basically just fallen apart, like they just would not have survived. So I can imagine that there may be something akin to the wage subsidy that comes back in an environment like this. That seems like potentially one sensible option. Could there be another CEBA-like program created at the time? I didn't want to ever utter those four letters together again in my entire life, but a loan-based program. Most of our members said, look, during COVID, they didn't need loans; they needed cash because they couldn't make it from the marketplace. This is a little bit different, but I would imagine there may be a combination of that. And we've already had the BDC and EDC reach out to us that they're doing work on what those programs could look like. The challenge for us all is that there's going to be both general impacts on everybody and specific impacts on individual sectors of the economy. And that's going to be hard to adjust. So everybody's going to be affected because the Canadian dollar already has dropped so significantly. And so the prices of imports from the US are already more expensive. And then if you add tariffs to that, would be dramatically more than that. And then, of course, there are going to be impacts on Canadian exporters. Our worry is that the focus goes only on exporters, those that are subject to the US tariffs, and like the big car companies and others get showered with cash. And then small firms that are affected as a secondary effect or are importing products from the US, they end up just getting handed the bill. And that's not what we want to see happen. Now, some of the language I've heard from both the Liberals and from Poilievre has been that they want to use all of the dollars that they collect from tariffs, from the reciprocal tariffs, and dedicate that to supports for Canadians and Canadian business owners. Our members have said some sort of emergency tax cut might be a good way to do that. So that could be some tax reduction, temporary as it is. I hope, of course, not modeled over the disastrous GST holiday that was in place on a handful of goods. But you could imagine some sort of tax cuts that could be helpful at this time. We are, of course, going to continue to poll our members regularly should tariffs come to be on what will be most useful. We've already got some data on that. But your ideas of what would help your company would be in order. My final point, Corinne, I think you referenced this, is when tariffs are used, Canadian tariffs are used, the government often does reach out to us and says, and to ask us how that's impacting our members. And then sometimes there are specific relief measures put in place for those businesses that are facing the Canadian end of the tariff stick.
Yeah. Okay, another question that came in though is asking if CFIB is providing a list of Canadian manufacturers and small businesses to help support the Buy Canadian. So maybe you can share a little bit of what we're trying to do there.
Yeah, look, this is a question we're getting a ton right now, and it's so encouraging to see so many Canadians out there just spontaneously trying to support Canadian companies at this time. We've been promoting that for many, many years as part of CFIB's Small Business Every Day initiative to try to encourage Canadians to shop small, shop local. And we have, as you noted a moment ago, special posters to do that. In fact, if you haven't already, perhaps one of our team could put up the link to our posters in the Q&A and in the chat so that you can see those on our website, download them and print them to post in your business at your point of sale, wherever you'd like. There's two things to keep in mind on Buy Canadian. I've seen a lot of initiatives where it's, somebody proudly buying their box of Canadian-made crackers at Costco and saying, isn't this great that I'm supporting Canadian business? And it is great. Don't get me wrong. I'm happy that they're buying the Canadian-made cracker. But isn't it more powerful if they're buying that Canadian box of crackers at a Canadian independent business? And so we're trying to wave the flag and remind people that there's two ways of supporting Canadian businesses. And one is to ensure that you're supporting the Canadian retail channel. And secondly, that you're supporting the Canadian manufacturing or distributors that are out there. We also want to take care that we're not asking Canadians to punish a lot of small businesses that do sell goods that are imported from the US. Lots of our members have bought, there's only a US made good in that particular item. And we don't want to send the message that for these small businesses that are sitting on, $100,000 in inventory from the US, that somehow buying that is a bad thing. Because you'd still be supporting that Canadian independent business along the way. So it is a nuanced discussion, and we have tried to provide some in the media interviews that we're doing and in the promotional work that we're doing through our special pages. We're trying to do just that.
Yeah, and I think that's an ongoing thing. The other a component of this that I wanted to touch on, which came in as a question prior to the webinar, was about franchises. What if you're a
Yes,
US-based franchise? And I think it's important to point out that even if you're a US-based franchise, you're still a Canadian small business.
absolutely.
So I think it's an important piece that I think gets lost in all of this. And I think there's a lot of fear among those that own maybe American franchises that are
That's it.
actually Canadian independent businesses.
Look, 100% agree to with that. Uh, because it's very easy to boycott, a chain restaurant that has a U.S. brand on it, even though the business is owned by, Jack and Susan in Chicoutimi. Like it's, yeah, well, I probably should have chosen a francophone name there. But in any event, look, this is so important, and that's why, for example, I saw online, don't buy Coke and Pepsi, buy Walmart soda, and I'm like, well, wait a minute. um, is that the best way to support Canadian? Because Coke and Pepsi are actually manufactured in Canada. And of course, as an avid addict to Diet Pepsi, I took great offense to that. But we do need to make sure that that this is a nuanced thing. A lot of a lot of chain restaurants buy Canadian goods, Canadian beef, Canadian dairy in an ice cream that might have a U.S. Ice cream shop that might have a U.S. brand on it. So we need to make sure that we wave the flag for all Canadian businesses, and that's why it's important to talk about the ownership of the retail channel, the front, the people that are behind the counter or stock in the shelves, not just where the good happens to be made or that the ownership of the brand that the business might be attached to.
Okay, we only have a few minutes left, but there's a couple things I wanted to touch on. I wanted to touch on a couple questions that have come in about the strength of the Canadian dollar. So
Yes.
Catherine's saying one of the challenges we face is the strength of the Canadian dollars we buy overseas. Most countries we deal with quote in US dollars.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on how we can push suppliers to accept payment in local currency? Um, and yeah, so I think that was Catherine a couple times. So there's that issue. I don't
Yes.
know if we have any advice there.
Look, it is a tricky one to figure out, but I will say if this holds, if the U.S. does do these blanket tariffs, I suspect a lot of world commerce outside of the United States itself will start to denominate in other currencies other than the U.S. dollar for this very reason, that it won't make sense for them to do that because the exchange rate against their, let's say you're buying something from Germany, that might be denominated in U.S. dollars, that may no longer make sense any longer. And so, look, for Canadian companies that sell in U.S. dollars, that right now it's a bit of a windfall, but that's gonna, it's hurting far more people than it's helping at this very moment. I mean, this is for exporters. One of the few positives out of this is that tariffs are driving down the dollar, so Canadian goods look cheaper to U.S. even with tariffs in some instances. But yeah, it is hard. It is going to be tough because so much of the world's commerce is denominated in U.S. currency.
Okay, I'm gonna, in the last couple of minutes, segue to a couple other topics that have
Yeah.
come up. One is, there's a couple questions, one from Robert and another one, as I scroll down quickly here, from Colin about crime. And
Mm-mm.
so what have we done? What can we do in order to help address crime and some of the issues that have been, more front and center in the last couple of years?
Such a great question. In fact, one of our senior team members, Ryan Mallow, who I believe is listening in on this webinar closely, was at a session with all of Canada's major business associations to try to plot out how we are going to figure out to take back cities and towns across the country that are dealing with with just huge upticks in crime rates. We did a major research study on this just a few months ago that showed that this is now affecting, I think it was close to the majority of businesses that have had some experience now with crime. And it's not just a big downtown issue, big city downtown issue any longer. I spoke to one of our board members in Fredericton who said that, his restaurants are being dramatically affected by crime and homelessness in the community. I spoke to a business owner in Cape Breton that said that, that there was a homeless guy breaking into her place every few weeks and had to get an order specifically against him. So yeah, there are some big worries against this. This is not a short-term fix. Obviously, there are major changes to the legal system that are necessary. It is good to see that I think we are starting to change some of the policies on drug consumption and these alternative sites that have been created across the country and that may clean up some of the action. But this is a growing issue. It was, gosh, 10 years ago, I would say this was priority number 100 on the list of small business priorities, and it's quickly risen through the ranks. So you can expect a lot more from us on this in the days ahead.
And Stephen, I want to get to this question, is also asking around any comments on the ongoing discussions between Canada Post and its unions. Supply chain disruptions have been constant theme for a couple of years, and it's not another thing I want to have to deal with again. So
yeah, no kidding. Well, look, you've been lead on Canada Post for decades, Corinne, but the larger question behind this, Canada has changed its labor legislation so dramatically over the last number of years that it has caved in to union demands. And this is affecting ports and railways and all of our major transportation infrastructure, including Canada Post. Canada's Post unions has been incredibly militant. The organization, the Postal Corporation is a walking disaster. We need to fundamentally rethink Canada Post for starters and make sure that we strip out a ton of its costs. But our members really do depend on a good working, functioning postal system. The unions dramatically overplayed their hand, and I do think that there is, especially with the election, a vulnerability that we could be right back in a postal strike. I think it was, wasn't it in May that this temporary pause is lifted?
Yeah.
So this is, there's a reason to be concerned about this. I don't know, Corinne, you probably have more to add on that.
No, I mean, other than we're following it closely, we follow all major supply chain disruptions, potential supply disruptions very closely. Thankfully, the railroads all settled recently. Within the last month, there was a risk of CP and CN Rail going on strike, but both of them actually did settle at the last minute. So thankfully, that's moving ahead. That would have been disruptive as well. Canada Post right now is the big one on the horizon, and we're just watching closely. There has been consultations. We've actually met with the folks doing their study on it. And so, of course, we're chatting more and more about what does the future look like for Canada Post, because it's not sustainable in its current form. And so that's been part of the conversation as well. So we're certainly providing our input to that, because it is still an important agency for small businesses in Canada. So.
Well, look, how many of our members were caught just by having checks that they need, like business checks that they were counting on for payments stuck in the mail? So that's a big one. I will just one political note on this. We should all be angry at all political parties for the mess that they have created with Canada's labor legislation. Every single one of them, including the Conservatives, supported a full ban on replacement workers in federally regulated entities like Canada Post, like the ports. So all of the political parties are right now courting the union vote much harder than they're courting the business vote or anybody else's. And that includes the Poilievre Conservatives. And it is shameful, I would say, on the part of all of our political parties, Liberals, Tories, NDP, Green Party, Conservatives, as to what they are doing to Canada's labor legislation in order to try to curry support from organized labor.
Okay, so Hemkesh, can we bring up the presentation yet again, because we're down to the final 2 minutes. And I just want to thank you, Dan, for your insights. So I'm sure we could talk for another 2 hours if we wanted to, but unfortunately we've come to the end. I wanted to share with folks, Dan did allude to this at the beginning, that we do have a webinar on March 20th, basically on all the various savings programs that we've had. We've been expanding it dramatically over the course of the last year, so it may be worth a peek to sort of see the different opportunities we may have available that could be a benefit to you. There's many affiliate and full partnerships that we have ongoing at the moment.
And Mark, you've asked a great question about adding brokerage services, so perhaps tune into that webinar because and suggest that, because that's a good one.
Yes, it is. Moving to the next slide. Also want to say, if this has been of interest to you, or you think there's somebody else who's a small business owner who may not be a member that maybe benefit from our services, we'd love for you to just refer them to us. And let them know what we can provide. Well, we have reached 100,000. We'd love to be at 200,000, if not more, so that we can continue to represent you as well as we can do that. And so with that, I know we've come to the end. We'll go to the last slide. This is our number. So if you have any other inquiries, if we didn't get to your question today, please call us. 1-833-568-2342 is the number to call. We will certainly be happy to answer your question at that point in time. Thank you, Dan, for joining us. Any last moments that you want to?
I know we've got to go, and I just want to say thank you to all of our members for your ongoing support. It is incredibly meaningful. And I have to admit, I feel super proud in moments like this to be part of representing 100,000 small and medium-sized companies. Your role is so incredibly important. Business owners do not get the support and love that they deserve, but I do recognize that Canadian businesses are starting to, people are starting to talk more about support Canadian businesses, and that's a good thing. Let's make sure we capitalize that on the days ahead. Thank you so much for your time and support today.
Great. And thank you, Dan. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. As like Dan said, you're the reason that we're here. And we really want to make sure that we continue to do everything we can to support you. But we also encourage you to give us a call or fill out the survey so that we can do it even more effectively. With that, we will close the webinar.